As many of you know, 97 Orchard Street is not just the subject of Andrew's wonderful book, but is one of two tenements that we interpret as the museum. The stories of the families who lived there are, of course, layered and complex, and Andrew's work has been instrumental in helping us understand and share the architectural and human history embedded in every brick, staircase, and floorboard of that building. I personally returned to that book again and again for not only inspiration, but as a source of new knowledge. It continues to deepen my understanding of the work that we do here. But tonight, we're excited not only to celebrate the publication of the third edition, but to welcome Michael Kimmelman, who will be in conversation with Andrew about his work on 97 Orchard Street. There will also be a brief Q&A at the end of the conversation, followed by mini tours of 97 Orchard Street, and then reception, books, of course. Both Michael's recent book and Andrew's third edition of Biography of Tenement will be available for sale and for signing after the conversation. So it's my pleasure to introduce them both. Michael Kimmelman is the architecture critic for the New York Times and author, most recently, as I just mentioned, of The Intimate City, Walking New York. He is founder and editor-at-large of Headway, a new philanthropically supported initiative at the Times addressing global challenges and paths to progress. He has reported from more than 40 countries, writing broadly on design and the built world, politics and culture, climate change, social and environmental justice. He, of course, also teaches in the Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Andrew Dolkart has been active in historic preservation in New York City for over 30 years. As a staff member at the Landmarks Preservation Commission, as a freelance consultant, and as a teacher, likewise in the Graduate School of Architecture, Preservation, and Planning and Preservation. I was mixing those two up at Columbia University. He has written extensively about the architecture and development of New York City, focusing in particular on the city's everyday vernacular buildings and how they influence the character of its neighborhoods. His books include Morningside Heights, A History of Its Architecture and Development, The Row House Reborn, Architecture Neighborhoods in New York City, 1908 to 1929, and then, of course, Biography of Tenement House in New York City, An Architectural History of 97 Orchard Street. So it's my pleasure to welcome both Michael and Andrew to the chairs behind me, and I'll hand over the microphone. And it's not really a stage, right? But chairs.
Hi, and we're thrilled to be here.
Yeah, we are. Let me just say, from my perspective, it's also wonderful to do this with Andrew, who's in two chapters of my book, because I couldn't think of anybody better to talk to me about New York City and its history. So it's an honor and a pleasure to do this with you, Andrew. All right, we are on Orchard Street at Delancey. You've written this really amazing thing now in its third edition about 97 Orchard Street, which is nearby. Paint for me a picture of what this area looked like, let's say, in the beginning of the 19th century, well before the building was built.
So in the beginning of the 19th century, it was still mostly open land, and it began to develop in the 18-teens, especially in the 1820s, when landowners began to subdivide the land into grids of streets. This grid actually here that we're on, which runs in a different direction from the grid that we mostly know, this was laid out in the mid-18th century, but there was no development on it. It was owned by the Delanceys, thus Delancey Street. The Delanceys were royalists. Land after the Revolutionary War was confiscated, so the city owned the land, and they didn't do anything with it. And then they began selling off property, and there was no regulation to what you could build here. So when this block begins to develop in the 1820s, it's mostly with wood frame buildings. Whereas if you were to walk farther south, where the grid changes at Division Street divided Delancey's property from the Rutgers property, and the Rutgers were very strict about what could be built on their land, very high-end row houses. appear there. So this is a neighborhood of contrasts, almost from the very beginning.
So before we get into how the Astors used to own this property, which is unexpected since it's known now as an area that had been tenement housing. But before we get into that, where did these people come from who settled here? They came from Lower Manhattan, yes?
They were coming from Lower Manhattan because, you know, when the city was founded, and in the 17th century and throughout the 18th century, everybody lived and worked in Lower Manhattan. But then and New York was a relatively minor city, but as New York harnessed its great all-weather deep water harbor, and commerce expands in New York, and New York becomes the center of commerce in America, commerce expands, and it forced people out of Lower Manhattan. And this neighborhood, we always think of the city growing north, but this neighborhood to the northeast was actually really close to downtown. So people begin moving here, and it becomes a very mixed income neighborhood. So all kinds of people settle here.
I would add one thing to that, and from our friend Eric Sanderson, which is that the people were leaving Lower Manhattan, in part because the development there had sort of spoiled the collect pond, which had been the fresh water source for the Lenape for thousands of years probably. And when the Dutch, English, and then the colonists, of course, began to settle around the collect pond, right, they began to poison it. And so there were these cholera and other outbreaks. And that, and with overcrowding, I mention this because the northward expansion wasn't just sort of commercial growth. There were other reasons why first wealthier people wanted to leave, and then other people wanted to leave. And they moved, this area was developed first, right? And then wealthier people moved a little farther north to the East Village now, and then even farther north to around the park. So the reason I'm belaboring that history is we're going to get into some of these histories of displacement. In this case, I found it really interesting in your book to learn that Astor originally bought this property. Maybe you could talk about that early period before the tenement was built. What was the speculative real estate here?
Okay, I'll answer that, but I just want to add one thing to what you were just saying, is that not only was the collect pond spoiled, but they're moving, which is where Foley Square is now in the courts. But there are Lisbonard Meadows, which was this swamp extended west towards the Hudson, and it was a barrier to moving north. So that made it easier for people to move to the Lower East Side also. So that's another reason why the Lower East Side becomes one of the earliest residential neighborhoods in the city. So especially on the city-owned property, the city was just selling it off, and they were selling it to speculative builders. And the Astors were the shrewdest land buyers in New York. The Astors' initial fortune came from furs, from beavers, which is why there's Astoria, Oregon, because they were trading all the way out in the Pacific Northwest. But what they did with their money was they bought real estate in undeveloped neighborhoods. And when the neighborhood developed, guess who owned it? They did. So Times Square was, owned by the Astors. So they invested here. Usually they didn't sell their land, they leased it. But here on the Lower East Side, they actually sold the land. So interestingly, where the Tenement Museum is now, they sold 3 lots to the Dutch Reformed Church. And there was a church on the site, and which they spent a lot of money building the church, and then they went bankrupt because they spent too much money on the church. And it then became a Universalist church, and then it became a Presbyterian church, and then it was sold to these 3 German developers. And
so that's an interesting part of the story too, because it was a Presbyterian church, but the people who began to move in here, which included German immigrants, right? This was not really a church that was going to appeal to the German immigrants. So there was also sort of, it was a church that had outlived, very briefly, its usefulness to the community. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned in the book that the Presbyterians were not very savvy in their investment, because at the time they bought, the neighborhood was becoming the center of German immigration. And the Presbyterians is a very ethnically based denomination, and there weren't many Scots living in the area. And so suddenly they had no congregation and there was actually so they had to sell relatively soon after they bought it.
Okay, so it's sold to German owners, investors, I guess, and out of that comes these houses, including 97 Orchard. So before we get to some of those details, what inspired you to do the book in the first place?
Well, it's a kind of strange way that I got involved in it, and I was, at the time, I wasn't a professor at Columbia yet, and I had my own architectural consulting business, and I was working on preservation projects all over the city, and I got a call from Anita Jacobson, who was one of the two founders of the museum, and she said, we're interested in creating a tenement museum. We think we found a building, which was like they had found it the day before yesterday, and we need somebody to do some background research on it. Could you come down and do it? And as those of you who know me have heard this story before, I thought this was like the most boring project I could ever work on. Like, why would anybody be interested in tenements? And I came down here, and literally, it changed my life. Standing in one of the ruined apartments on the second floor was one of the most powerful experiences of my professional career, and it changed the whole way I look at the city. Dave said when he was introducing me that I'm really interested in the vernacular, everyday architecture of New York that's so common we don't see it, but yet it creates what we are as a city. And tenements are one of those. And so I said, of course, I will do this, and I got involved in doing the research, and eventually it got turned into a book, and then I really haven't stopped doing the research because there's new things in the third edition that I didn't know when we first started this.
But weren't there also personal aspects of sort of doing this research for you, looking into the history of tenements?
Well, yeah, but, when I stood in that ruined apartment, and I think a lot of people probably have this experience that you remember the stories like that your grandparents told you, and so it was really powerful to me to think about my immigrant ancestors living like this. And then I discovered later, and this is the first line in the book, is that I was down here with my father walking around, and my father pointed to the building where he says he was born, which is the Mayflower apartment house on East Broadway. And it says Mayflower over the top. And to me, that was like the most powerful metaphor for America, that my father grew up in this building that was built by Jewish builders, designed by Jewish immigrants to house poor Jewish immigrants. And there it was the Mayflower, and it was all about becoming Americans. And I think that that's a story that the museum tells about what it meant for immigrants to come to America and become Americans.
I mean, it's a story that this 97 Orchard tells too, obviously, through many generations and through different ethnic groups as well. The 97 Orchard, who were the first people who moved in? First of all, let's talk about the architecture, and the building a little bit, the fabric. You go into this in the book, and it's actually really wonderful because it's an anonymous building. That is to say, we don't know who the architect is. It's an Italianate building, but sort of. So maybe you could just describe who this person was who must have been hired to do this building and how they put it together.
So I think it was designed by an architect, but it was begun just a few months before the buildings department started keeping records. So what I do know, because I've looked for the architect of every other building in the surrounding streets, is that all the early tenements had architects. Mostly they were German immigrants. Many of them were not that well trained, and they started at the bottom rung. So I'm pretty sure it was an architect who designed it. He designed it for Lucas Glockner, who was a tailor and a small investor in real estate. And I think that's the story of a lot of tenements, and goes into the 20th century with 6-story apartment buildings, small-scale investors. Glockner was a German immigrant. The neighborhood was largely German at the time. But one of the things that I discovered, and it wasn't something I had ever thought about before, is, because I learned about architectural styles and things, and I saw the building, it's Italianate. it has, if you look at the cornice, it has heavy brackets. It's a key element of Italianate architecture. But I don't think that the architect was trying to design a fashionable Italianate building. He was putting the building together. You go to a building yard and you buy a cornice, and of course the cornice is going to be what's in style at the time. So he buys an Italianate cornice and he puts it on the top, or he goes and buys a newel post and stair railings, and that's what you get when you go and buy these things. So it accidentally reflects the style of the time rather than having been designed by an architect like we think of today as architects as designers. It's a put together.
It was a kit of parts,
Kit of
essentially.
parts, yeah.
Which he went to Walmart or Costco or whatever,
Right.
Basically to find those parts and put them together. What were the basic components of the building? Like, how much of it was residential? What was on the ground floor? What was the basic, style of a tenement at that point?
So there was no regulation or minimal regulation of tenements. It had to have solid party walls and a cornice, basically. That's the only regulation. So you could do whatever you wanted. So there were stores on the ground, on the basement level. So it was commercial on the basement level, and then on the 5 floors, there were 4 apartments per floor. So that's 20 apartments, and then in the stores, there were 2 apartments behind. So there were 22 apartments in this building that's on a lot that's around 25 feet. So
25 feet wide, yeah.
25 feet wide. So so that's a lot of people in the building. And then when you look at census records and other things, there were 4, 5, 6, 7 people living in an apartment. Later, even more. But
I think you at some point said there were up to 117 people living in this
there
small
were
building.
there was later, around 1900, there were apartments with 11 people in. Which, if you haven't been in, when you go in and see an apartment, you'll see that's crowded.
And there had been regulations that were passed, or at least the beginning of some attempt to sort of humanize the tenements, right around the time this building was built. But for instance, if I recall, you talk about running water and toilets and stuff like this. The building, how was 97 set up?
So 97 was pretty minimal.
Actually below standard for the time, right?
There was water on the street, but they didn't hook into it. And you didn't have to hook into it, and if you did, you had to pay a fee every year. So they could have put in running water. They could have had flush toilets. There was an outhouse or a series of outhouses called school sinks in the backyard, and they had to be connected to the sewer. So the super, if there was one, was supposed to flush it once a day. You can imagine how unpleasant this was. So it probably wasn't done all that often. So it was minimal in many ways, but every now and then we discovered something that was a little bit above minimal to make it habitable. My assumption was when I first started, you'll see if you have never been inside that there are windows cut in the walls between the rooms, and it was assumed that those windows were cut in later because in 1901 they were required. But as it turned out,
basically a transom to allow air to flow.
No, actually a whole window.
A whole window.
But what it turns out is that the window between there are 3 rooms in every apartment, and only the front room has any windows in it. So most of the rooms had no light or air. But the inner bedroom, the window between the inner bedroom and the kitchen turned out to be original. So, and that was not required by law. So they were, making that bedroom somewhat more habitable.
There are a couple of things about that, and you and I have talked about this a little bit. One is that it's important, I think, as you've said, to remember where a lot of these people came from and what this was like to move to. Because, and one of the experiences of the Tenement Museum is to understand just the hardships of living in these conditions and how many people lived in them. And that's a story essentially of triumph over adversity. But many of these people were coming from shtetls and other places where this was not perceived necessarily as a step down, right?
Well, I think that that's a really important issue to consider is maybe less for the German immigrants who sometimes came from urban backgrounds, and so were used to living with other people, and there's a tenement history of Germany that we don't understand enough about, but especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, when this becomes the home of largely Eastern European Jews who were moving from rural shtetls and were not used to urban living, so it was very different. But if you think of the way the tenement was built and the fact that, well, there was even a toilet in the backyard, or after 1905, there was a toilet inside for every two families. This was an improvement over rural life. And this came really, this point where it was made really strong with me when one time I was brought a class down here a number of years ago, and I had a student who was from Korea, and she said to me, this would be an improvement over the way my grandparents in Korea live. And it really struck me that, yeah, you have to understand where people came from. And we think of it as the worst possible kind of housing, but in some cases it was probably better than what they knew.
I mean, we could shift the subject entirely and talk about the equivalent of this sort of housing today. We think about this as something that existed in another century. There are people living in the basements of apartments in Jackson Heights, some of them on hotbeds, and it's really not a very different situation. Those are dangerous places. Often people make do for precisely the reason that they believe coming here is about an economic or other opportunity that they don't have at home, right?
Yeah, and there, just around here, there are buildings where significant numbers of Chinese immigrants are living in the same apartment. So you could have 15, 20 guys living in an apartment. Maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the New Yorker did this series, and they really detailed this issue and about how difficult it was for housing reformers to deal with, because if they reported that these were illegal, these people would be evicted, and where would they go?
And there's a whole economy that now exists around maintaining this, and tension around formalizing a lot of these things. So it's an interesting thing that we're talking about a building that opened in the 19th century that was more or less cooked by the 1930s, so almost a century ago. And yet here we still are. We're having
the same, some of the issues are the same, and that's not the only issue that parallels. One of we have different waves of immigrants moving here, and then the restrictive immigration laws come. And I've been working for a while on a book about the garment industry, and I've been reading the architecture of the garment industry, and I've been reading the annual reports of the factory inspector of the state of New York, and his anti-immigrant rhetoric could be read today by what's his name, the Trump's assistant anti-immigrant person. Yeah, Stephen Miller could say the exact same language. So things don't change.
Yeah, that's a happy note.
Yeah. I'm saying this in a lively way, but it's very depressing.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you say this because we're also near Chinatown, and what an interesting community that is too, which was born of the Chinese diaspora after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and the community essentially became, as it did in other cities, a kind of self-sustaining, almost gated community, not quite, but and so there was something of the same thing, I think, in all of these immigrant communities that settled into the tenements and in other places too, Harlem and elsewhere later, that they were incubating and safe spaces, even though we talk often about how unsafe the conditions were. I'm looking out here now, it's wonderful to see people walking on Orchard Street, but what must this have been like at the turn of the previous century?
Well, Orchard Street, if we were looking out, it would have been packed, because Orchard Street was a center for push carts. And you look at the old photographs, and not only are there the push carts, but the streets are packed with people. And I don't think we can imagine just how congested the streets were. We don't experience that any longer. So this is a really big change that's occurred.
And if you lived in 97 or any of these other tenements, you either were living in the apartment in the front, which was an advantage in some ways because it got a lot of light, where it was also crazy loud, or you're living in the back where it was dark, or if you were passing through the halls, it was pitch dark because there was only gas lighting, right, installed later. And then electricity even later. So I think this is also an interesting thing in your book, to sort of, you get into this wonderful granularity about what the actual conditions were to be there, which we relate to now because we can see, how simple things like putting a light at the second story landing transforms the way people experience life, just daily life. Like, I'm not going to fall down the stairs. I'm not going to step on that small child which is in the hallway. I'm hoping that somebody's door is open because some light and air may come in from the outside. But the front of the building was probably daily chaos and noise. Yeah.
So, what you say is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this book, because there were books about the broad history of housing in New York and of tenements, like Richard Plunz's great book, History of Housing in New York. And it establishes all the laws and the major issues, but nobody had looked with, as you say, the granularity. And what I think of what I did was I went into the very specifics to make it universal. That every tenement's going to have a separate history, but they're all similar because they're all doing the same things at about the same time because they're responding to laws or they're responding to real estate pressures, and it kind of turned the history that had been done inside out to just look very specifically at things.
So and that's right about the changing laws, because there was talk about the living conditions in tenements in the middle of the 19th century, and they continued, and then you had reform in the early part of the 20th century too, and finally you had even more. There was by the time this building was no longer occupied by 117 people in the 30s. So part of that was about a constant effort, which we are still in the midst of now, of trying to figure out how to improve our own housing conditions. How do you look at that sort of, wave or pendulum swing of housing in New York, in which there have been periods of, scarcity, periods of abundance. The tenement, this building here, goes through several of those periods. There's a period of, scarcity now. To live here is an expensive thing to do. But not so many decades ago, you could, live here for a song.
Or the buildings were abandoned.
Or the buildings were literally abandoned, yeah. What is the story of 97 in its larger arc?
Well, I think that one of the stories about it as a habitable place is always in private ownership, is how the owners adapted to new rules, how they made you wanted to keep your building fully rented because that's how you made a profit. So how did they attract people to live here as opposed to maybe a newer building? Or how did they respond to the major law that impacted on this building was the Tenement House Act of 1901, which was the first law that required changes to previously built buildings. So they adapted in the cheapest way possible. And that's really interesting to see these speculative owners responding to the law with spending the least amount of money that they could. They had to put in water, so they buy the absolute least expensive sink possible. And I found the sink in the trade catalog for the company that made it, and it is their least expensive item. And then they have to put in a second sink for hot water, and it's the least expensive sink for that company too. And how they would reuse woodwork. If they had to cut in something, they would reuse the material. And I think that when the architects were working on it, and the architects, by the way, are here, They reused everything because you wanted to do it as inexpensively as possible, and I think that's a really important story about the building.
Yeah, nothing changes in the story about, about developers trying to do that. But the other thing that was happening in 1901, right, was light and air. There was really the perception that this was a major health problem. If you think about the 1916 zoning, what is that about? Setbacks, it's about light and air. So there was this whole, you see this as a large arc in the reshaping of New York in a very broad way. Their first solution to bringing in light and air, of course, was also the cheapest. And you can explain that if you wish. But I wanted to, after you do that, I wanted to talk to you about what the solution to tenement housing was, because it's also not so far from here in terms of the public housing projects of the 1930s and 40s that line now the East River, not so far away. What were the early solutions that tenement owners had to the problem of bringing in light and air?
Well, the first thing is the Tenement House Act of 1879, which required that every room have a window that looked out on the street, the backyard, or a light or an air shaft. And that's what led to the famous dumbbell tenement. And although this building has been reconfigured a lot, these were dumbbell tenements here. And
just very briefly for those who don't know, what is a dumbbell tenement?
So it's because you had to have a window in every room, but they didn't do anything about the 25-foot wide lot. So New York buildings tended to be on 25-foot wide lots. The only way to do it is to pinch the middle. So you have a shaft in the middle, and it looks like a dumbbell weight. So people called them dumbbell tenements. Officially, we call them old law tenements. The dumbbell wasn't the only way to do it. It was the popular way to do it. So. And it was widely criticized. It was seen as a complete failure.
It was an air shaft, but
it was an air shaft.
So teeny.
It was
in
teeny.
width, yeah.
I found one source that referred to them as shake your hand tenements because you could reach out across the light shaft and shake your neighbor's hand. But just imagine, the smells emanating from that, and people threw garbage out into it, and it acted as a flue in a fire. So it was hardly a notable reform.
Up. Right, exactly. The reason I wanted you to talk about that a little bit was the solution to that arose, right? The public housing solution, which we think of now as tower in the park housing, was to provide people with what they lacked before.
With light and air.
Light and air. We now look at a lot, and there's so much criticism of the tower in the park as a design. But at the time, and we can see this when we hear people talk about moving into some of those projects, not just here, but everywhere. Pruitt-Igoe, the famous one that was blown up, on television, basically, that was supposedly the symbol of the calamity of public housing. The people who moved into Pruitt-Igoe too saw that in the beginning as a salvation from the kind of housing which was not dissimilar to this, that they had occupied. I find that really an important thing to remember, that in all sorts of ways, that this was the solution to the problem that people coming from the shtetls in Eastern Europe found. It then became the problem that produced another kind of housing model that was considered wonderful, and now many of us have come to regard, I don't, but many people have come to regard as the problem. I mean, I find that a really important lesson of a place like 97.
I think that it is, and that I think it's important to see the public housing projects, to see Baruch houses and Lillian Wald houses and the projects that are in the East River as the culmination of this reformer's desire for light and air. And those apartments have lots of light and air and lots of landscaping. There's even been, I think, somebody told me about this, I haven't read it, that there's a study that shows that in the summer, the temperature on the ground in those projects is lower than on the surrounding streets because there's so much landscaping, and explains why the people that live there are largely opposed to building other towers on that land. But I think one thing that's interesting is that is public housing, and so the public domain is building these buildings with lots of light and air and public. When it
low
came
density, it was very crucial.
Low density,
right? Much because density was an issue.
But low density, but actually housing a lot of people because they're tall. But when it came to the private world, where the government is kind of regulating private construction, you get the Major Reform Act, the 1901 Tenement House Act, and it's requiring toilets in every apartment and more light and air, but still it's very minimal in many cases. And it was the reform, but it was a reform that was colored by an understanding that the real estate industry was still very powerful in New York, even if they opposed the law at all completely. At least they weren't being told to do too much.
I want to stick on the density point for just one quick second, because I have a little nit to pick about this issue, only because a lot of the opposition to the Tower on the Park model is that they were big, tall towers, and that people who don't like that, they like. In fact, they are low density because of the amount of land they take up, even if they're a bit taller. I think the densest building in New York City, what is the one on 23rd Street between 8th and 9th, that massive? London Terrace, which was built as worker housing. I think that is the densest building in New York City. Of course, now, you can't buy an studio apartment there for under, or make $1 million. So the idea that that's worker housing is crazy. But all of this grows out of, I think, a conversation around what is a proper sort of density for an urban environment. And the street changes and the buildings change. The conversation fundamentally doesn't. Until, let's just take this a little forward, because we have a few minutes left before we'll open this up. So what happens by the 1930s here, and how do we arrive at this as a museum?
So the 1930s down on the Lower East Side is really interesting, and something that I didn't know, and I don't think a lot of people know, is that in the 1930s, the Lower East Side was being immensely depopulated for a number of reasons. One was the restrictive immigration laws in 1924, so the neighborhood wasn't regenerating itself. And once immigrants began to do well economically, they would move out. They would follow the subway lines to Brooklyn and the Bronx. And especially after the garment industry becomes increasingly unionized and salaries go up, people could afford to move out of the area, and nobody's coming in to replace them. So buildings like 97 Orchard Street are just basically closed down on the upper floors because the stores brought in a lot of rent. There's even an example right around the corner on the corner of Broome and Ludlow, where they actually chopped off the top 4 floors of the building, and they were just left with the first floor and the basement, because there wasn't a market for it. So the building gets abandoned on the upper floors, and the stores flourish here. And there were other abandoned buildings down here, and that's how it remained from 1935, when the building is emptied, which was not full because you couldn't rent all the apartments. The owner could, and the other issue that was important to this is that the city in the early 30s passed a law that mandated fireproofing on the interiors of tenements, which would have meant removing all of the wood in the public areas. So the stairs and the woodwork, it just wasn't worth it for the owner. So he closes it down. And then the Tenement Museum discovers it, and here we are today. And the idea of the Tenement Museum was a vision, especially of Ruth Abram, to have a museum that would reflect the experience of most Americans who went through urban centers. That most house museums are either famous people or the very wealthy or the earliest house in the area, from the 18th century. And this was a whole novel idea, and it was a great idea, but how did you do it, I think? And I give credit to Ruth and Anita Jacobson, because they were pretty open-minded. They brought in people, they brought in scholars and, from all different backgrounds to talk about what a tenement museum could be. I think the first really brilliant decision that they made I was at this meeting when one historian of material culture, decorative arts and such, said, you should tell the real stories of people that lived in the building, even though you don't know who they are at the moment, and not make up stories about immigrants. And that set the museum off on discovering the people. And fortunately, at that time, in the 1980s, there were still people alive who had grown up in the building. And what an amazing thing that was to be able to interview those people and record them. So that was one thing that was really great. But then, what did it mean to have a tenement museum? How did you go about doing it? How did you make it available to the public? How did you allow people in with the fire laws and such? And that's where Judith and Roz, helped a lot with figuring that out, how you could legally get people in. But what I think is amazing about the museum and where it was really cutting edge is that they did two things that were really novel, I think, for house museums at the time. One had to do with making it available to the public, in that one of the interesting things about the museum is how it's changed over time, and that you can read, when were gas fixtures put in, when was electricity put in, when was water put in, all these things. And so a decision was made not to hide any alterations that were being done, but to make them visible, because they're part of the history of the building. And think of going to most house museums, and they put in a fire detector and they paint it the same color as the ceiling. Well, they don't do that here. And the other thing was that when you go to the museum, you time travel. And that was a really amazing thing that you can go into on a tour, and you can go into an apartment from the 1860s, and then 5 minutes later, you're in an apartment from the 1880s or the 1930s. And I think that there was some concern that, well, people aren't going to be able to deal with that. Well, people can deal with that really easily. And it's exciting to do that. So it helps to explain why this museum is so popular and a lot of house museums aren't.
And I think it's wonderful that in the book you have a section about this issue, these issues themselves, because they apply to really the way we think about preservation in general, and how it's not just a architectural issue, it's an issue around art. Preservation is art conservators, right, have had a similar conversation. Do we just make it look like we haven't done anything? Do we show those changes to reveal the conservation of the Sistine went through a lot of these same conversations around how do we tell the layers of history? I found it, we lived in Germany for some years, in Berlin, and to see how that played out there in institutions like the Neue Museum, and how much, and along Unter den Linden, and whether you sort of cover up the past, whether you include it. So I think one of the beautiful things about the Tenement Museum and about your book is that it embraces these layers of history, because really we are making that history ourselves, even in the process of discussing the history that the buildings went through.
And I think it's really important, at least it's important for me, that, maybe it wasn't important when I first started my career, but because of my working with the Tenement Museum, is I like to say that buildings have lives, and that it's not just about the brick. It's not just about who the architect was or the date, but that it's how people have lived in it and how it over time. And I think that that's what makes architecture so powerful, and that's a direction that preservation has moved into, is understanding that.
We want to open this up for some questions. So someone needs this microphone, maybe.
I'm going to keep the mic for anyone who may have a question. Questions? Yeah.
Hi, this is a kind of geeky question. I just want to, I'm also a professor at the Graduate School of Architecture at Columbia, so you'll have to excuse me, and I adore Andrew. But I also think about real estate, and when I hear the history of how this building was regulated, just tenements in general, regulated over time, one of the curiosities, and people here may know this, is that buildings are not regulated uniformly in this city. There still are old law tenements, there's new law, there's new building regulation, and at some point, it will all be in a unified building code, maybe. But what was interesting about your talk was the way that building owners, thinking about the real estate, had to make changes to their buildings after they were already up and in service. There was no what we call grandfathering. And I wonder now, with the exception of maybe, I'm trying to think, maybe asbestos or something like that, where you find something is bad that you didn't know, and for safety you have to get rid of it. The idea of taking buildings and requiring them to be retrofit right now, I just wonder how you think that would play out with today's real estate owners and industry, because clearly people abided by it even if they looked for the cheapest
Well, it's
things.
really interesting that was so controversial when the 1901 Tenement House Act said that you had to put in one toilet for every 2 families inside the building, which meant that they were going to have to change the floor plans of the apartments. And the owners banded together and they sued. And there was an agreement that was made between the owners and the city that as soon as the lower court made the decision, it would immediately be appealed. And it was appealed, and the city won at every level, all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that it was within the rights of the city for health and welfare to require the changes that were in the 1901 Tenement House Act. But it was incredibly controversial. And later when they demanded fireproofing, so there's a history of that being done, not regularly, but these kinds of changes that are required, and they've always been controversial.
Just to add one tiny thing to that, it's a really interesting question, Kate, because I think we now look at a lot of sort of evolving mandates, whether it's ADA or other things, as moral and necessary things to do. One of the things about them is they do come with costs, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying they are real, those costs, and so there are always decisions being made. It's not only that the real estate owners are cheap. It's that the costs of doing that have other ripple effects.
ADA is a great example, because if you do something significant to a building, you have to incorporate it. But if you don't, and you just leave the building as is, it's tough on those with disabilities.
Right. That's absolutely true. So, yeah, I'm just saying, I think it's interesting. We sometimes don't play out all the implications. Even what it means in terms of if you do design, it's going to sound like I'm against the idea. It's one of the greatest laws that's ever been passed. But it does come with issues, right? It reduces the number of units maybe that are going to be built, and so forth. So I'm sure that was part of the real estate argument. Like, you're making us do this, we're not going to be able to do other things. I find that always an interesting tension.
There are 2 other interesting points vis-a-vis what you said. One is that the 1901 Tenement House Act said that you could not have inner bedrooms, bedrooms that were 2 rooms away from a window, and the United Building Owners, or whatever they were called, they went back to the state legislature and they complained about that, and that law was changed. And they had to cut the window in, which I was talking about before, which were already in our building. So they were able to get some changes. But the other really interesting thing about this is that there were things that were grandfathered in. So the tenement had a fire escape originally, and like we're used to fire escapes that have stairs on them. They had a fire ladder on there. So there was one long vertical ladder. So can you imagine if you have 2 babies and an 80-year-old grandmother living on the 5th floor? How did you get down? And those are grandfathered in, and there are several around the city still. And let me tell you, if you're ever going to rent a building with a fire ladder, don't rent it. But they're still there; they're grandfathered in. And when that fire escape was removed in the 1980s, and when a new fire escape was put up, the frame is to the original design, but it has a stair because you wouldn't want anybody to be in it with a ladder.
I'll go to you first.
Hi. It's interesting to hear you talk about, they even back then they were doing it cheap, right? Because today, I live in a new building. It might look fancy, but they still do it really cheap, right? They still build, they cut corners, and I've had repair people come over, plumbers, talking about all the new building. They don't build them like they used to. They cut corners. It ends up costing more money in the end, and I'm sure they might have said the same thing back then. But what do you think are some of the advantages that the old buildings have over the new buildings? Like, what did they? What do you think was commendable and maybe even should be, kept up or returned to as far as the way that they're designed? And because of course today we look at new buildings and they just look so completely different and are built so different. So yeah, do you see any really worthy advantages that the old, even 1860s buildings have compared to new ones?
Well, they didn't value engineer something down because they didn't know how to do that. And so, these buildings have thicker walls, so they're probably a little bit more soundproof. So they're pretty, in its low cost way, they're actually kind of quite well built, even though they were as cheap as, they did it as thriftily as possible to do. So I think that they have that. One of the things that amazes me is how these buildings, which people couldn't get out of fast enough, as soon as they had the money, they would move somewhere else. Their great-grandchildren are paying very high rents to live in now. And I'm sure their great-grandparents would be shocked to know that. But I think, people have combined apartments, so the buildings are kind of solid, and you can make them livable here. And you have to change the plumbing and put in a toilet in every apartment and do things like that. So they still have assets. And plus, it's a neighborhood. There's street life and things like that, which are kind of nice. I was with my class recently, and we were doing something looking at buildings in the neighborhood of Columbia, and we were on 120th Street between Morningside Drive and Amsterdam Avenue, and there's a very new building, and it had an F rating, and I'm thinking, really? And a new building with an F rating, and you looked at the building, and it's 3 years old, and it's falling apart.
I think we had a question over here. Yeah.
I was just wondering and if there were specific catalysts for reasons for changes in the law. So I know you said 1879, 1901, and the 1930s were big years for that. So yeah, what specifically happened that these new laws were passed?
One of the interesting things about these reform laws is that they did not emanate from the people that lived in the tenements. They were top down. They were progressive reformers who saw problems here. And some of these progressive reformers were really altruistic, and they really cared about conditions, and others were more self-serving. They were afraid that diseases were going to breed on the Lower East Side and spread to their more wealthy neighborhoods. So it was pressure from reformers that led to each one of these reform acts, well, especially 1879 and really 1901. There was a huge pressure for trying to get rid of the dumbbell tenements, and to make it not illegal but extremely difficult to build on a 25-foot wide lot. Did the residents down here think this was an improvement? That's a mystery here. The 1930s, the 1935 law, I'm not quite exactly sure why they did this, except that there were so many row houses that were being converted into tenements, and they were becoming fire traps. And so I think all multiple dwellings fell under this fireproofing law.
I was just going to say one thing about that, and also let us put it in a word for journalists who are pointing out the problems. But I think it's interesting that these changes took place over decades and generations. And when we look back, it doesn't seem like that long a period of time. But I say that only because, when you're in the midst of things as we are now, we have an affordable housing shortage, and this has been going on now for a long period of time, it seems, and it takes so long to build housing. I don't have an answer to this question, but is that long or is that not long? In other words, those reformers were talking about this in the 1860s. And then changes took place over the next 60, 70 years. And we can see that now, and we can see the progressive steps of that and the different kinds of campaigns. But in that moment, decades passed. And for some of the people who were living there, that was either a hardship or an avoidance of some of the construction and other problems that would accrue from new regulations. I don't know what to make of that, but I just think it's important to think about, because I think we expect change to happen at a pace that isn't really historically even true. Yeah, just a passing thought.
Hi, I'm sorry, this is absolutely a ridiculous question, but maybe this, the opportunity to ask it. Jacob Riis, when he was photographing people, do you have any anecdotal evidence of how he actually went about that and the people sitting there? Like, if someone came to my apartment, I'm not letting them take a picture of me. Like, how is there any literature about that?
This is really interesting, and I have I've looked at those pictures a lot, and I think a significant number of them are staged. I don't think that he tried to pass them off as this is, I just walked into this space. He had to set up a camera with a flash. These were not just
staged.
I'm taking a picture. These were staged images.
Would he pay them to be sit there and
Did people just sit there and wait? I agree with that. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's really important to look back on a lot of these sort of historical documents. Matthew Brady's photographs in the Civil War, famously. One of the greatest journalists to write about the neighborhood was Joseph Mitchell. I'll just say, as somebody who's done this my whole life, especially with longhand, it's a little hard to take down a quote that's about 5,000 words long. So, they're beautiful pieces of writing and literary history. But I think we have to look at them as being really different than you walking down the street with your phone and snapping a picture of somebody.
I do think, I don't think all the images that you see of the Lower East Side are staged, and I think that there are all those incredible street images. Just that you see that didn't need to be staged. But Riis was a propagandist, and so he's taking pictures to illustrate the textual propaganda in his writings.
I don't.
We have one right here.
Sure. Okay. Last one.
So hopefully this isn't too broad, but I've thought for a long time there is a surprising dearth of landmark protection for tenement districts like the Lower East Side, Hell's Kitchen, and East Harlem. And I'm just wondering if there's anything in the pipeline that might, thanks to the work of the Tenement Museum and the increased appreciation for the history of tenement life, push some of those neighborhoods toward being protected and recognized up there with the Greenwich Villages and Brooklyn Heights of the city.
So there are some small districts in the East Village that have been done that include a lot of tenements. But you're right. Tenements have not been recognized much by the Landmarks Commission. I think a lot depends on who the next mayor is and who they appoint as their landmarks commissioner. We've been in an era of what I would call politely designation drought. There hasn't been much designated in recent years, and there are a number of National Register districts in this area, but the National Register has no teeth to it. So this is the National Register district that we're in, but the major change and demolition has occurred. So it would be great if the Landmarks Commission did look into this really crucial part of New York's history.
Thank you.
So thank you all, and thank you, Michael.